Welcome back, everybody. My name is Jason. I'll be your host on this CFL talk show, Hussey's Huddle. In this video, we're going to be talking about the biggest draft need that every CFL team has going into the 2022 CFL Draft. But really quickly, before we get started, if you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting the like button and subscribing to Hussey's Huddle for more CFL content just like this. I greatly appreciate it, everybody. And with that said, let's get on with the video. So for a lot of these teams, the need is going to be obvious to fans of that given team. But I will also throw in some other things that, I think the team could address in terms of needs, in terms of kind of like secondary needs as well for the really obvious ones on this list. Starting at Hamilton, we're going to start with the offensive line. And I think specifically they need offensive tackle help. Chris Van Zyl, he's great, but he's 38 years old. He isn't getting any younger. This could be his last season. And they got to think about what's that plan going to be next year in terms of a ratio-wise if Van Zyl does, in fact, play his last season here in 2022. I think they really need to start developing a tackle prospect on this roster if they want to continue starting a Canadian there. And I really don't think there's any noteworthy tackle prospect on this roster. You have Kay Okafor, who has seen some starts at tackle, but really struggled in all of his appearances. I really don't think there's much there other than kind of a career backup role for him. So I really think this is the need for Hamilton, specifically offensive tackle in this draft class. Next up on the list, we have the Calgary Stampeders. And for this one, it was really difficult to pick a position that they really do need because they have really good depth pretty much everywhere on this roster from a Canadian perspective, as I said in my Canadian talent video the other week. And so what I'm going to go with here is defensive back, and this is largely because of a trade they made earlier this offseason, trading Royce Metchie, their starting safety, for linebacker Cameron Judge, who's going to be a starting linebacker for them. But they don't really have that, stud defensive back prospect on this roster right now. And, even though I don't think they're going to start a Canadian at defensive back this year, it's always good to keep developing guys at that position. You never know. It's very convenient for teams a lot of the time to slide in a Canadian at safety, but they don't really have that guy that is a proven option at that spot right now, and they haven't really invested really high draft picks in that position as well. So I think defensive back is a high need going into this draft for Calgary. Moving from east to west here, we have the Montreal Alouettes. And for them, I think it's easy, and that's offensive line. They don't really have that blue chip young offensive line prospect on this roster. They drafted guys like Carter O'Donnell that is with the Indianapolis Colts in the NFL. He's ended up sticking around down there the last couple of years, so that's unfortunate for them. But they don't really have that young prospect on this roster. They have a bunch of really experienced veterans, but at a certain point that you're going to need that talent infusion on that offensive line. And so I think that is a key need for them going into this draft. I'll also add that their depth behind starting linebacker Chris Aki and projected starting safety Marc-Antoine Dequoy is pretty thin as well. So I could see them going there in the draft as well. Now for Winnipeg, and I think this one is a relatively easy one when I look at the roster. I say it's defensive line because yes, you have Jake Thomas, who is a stud defensive tackle for them, and he's done so much in his years of service, so many years of service for that team. But they don't really have anybody behind him at all. And I'm pretty sure when I looked, they don't even have, a signed national besides Jake Thomas on the defensive line on this roster. So I think going into the draft, it's very smart for them to try to start developing some kind of replacement in the future for Jake Thomas, a guy that can rotate with him as he gets older here. Who knows how long is he going to play still in the CFL. So I think defensive line is a need for Winnipeg going into this draft. For the Edmonton Elks, I have defensive line as their biggest need going into this draft. They did sign McConnell Henry, defensive tackle from Saskatchewan, in free agency, but I think he's more of a short-term fix here that doesn't really provide a ton of upside, especially after you lose two nationals in Mathieu Betts and Kwaku Boateng in free agency. Even though those guys didn't really produce too much for them last year, they were still important prospects in their organization from that position. So I do think they could use a young body. And I say this as well because last year they did select a defensive lineman in the first round, Cole Nelson. But I was listening to a podcast, 3 Down Nation. Those guys are usually pretty well connected. They said Cole Nelson is likely to make a switch to the offensive line this offseason and play offensive line this season in 2022. So I think defensive line is a big need for the Elks going into this draft. Now moving back to the East Division, we have the hardest team to select primary need for this draft, and that is the Toronto Argonauts, who I mentioned in a video the other week have the best Canadian talent in the CFL. For them, I'm going with the running back position, and this wouldn't have been a need before this offseason, but this free agency period, they signed Canadian running back Andrew Harris. And, it's not because I think, Toronto can switch around their ratio and start Canadians at other spots, but if they get settled into a position early on in the season, say they're playing really well when Andrew Harris is in there, and then Harris gets injured, he's 35 years old, it's decently likely, they wouldn't have to switch around their whole position if they have a capable Canadian backup, which they currently don't on this roster. So I think running back could be a need for them going into this draft, albeit it's not as big of a need as other teams have on this list. I'll also add in a thing that's not really a need per se, but the quarterback position with Trey Ford sitting out there. I think with Toronto being in the unique position that they're in, they have so much depth at a lot of these positions. I think they could be an ideal landing spot for Ford on draft day. Now moving back out west, we have the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and I think their biggest need is offensive line. In particular, the interior offensive line that, was pretty underperforming last year. I think in pass protection, they had some moments, but they weren't really getting that push up front that they need to get that play action game going and get that run game going to, really help Fajardo. So I think that they could really afford to add another blue chip prospect to that inside. I think a lot of people are going to have them, projected to take provincial prospect Noah Zur out of Saskatchewan with that first round pick that they have. But I think it's, even though it's an obvious selection here, I think, offensive line is a big need for Saskatchewan going into this draft. Pretty much elsewhere, I think that they have a lot of good depth. So I think offensive line is definitely the highest priority for them. Now with our final team in the East, the Ottawa Redblacks, and the position I'm going with is wide receiver. And it's not that they don't have some good, experience out there. A lot of guys that have, contributed on CFL offenses, guys like Shaq Johnson, Nate Bahar, and Levi Noel that they signed this offseason. But I don't think any of those guys are really going to be that difference-making star for this team. And with this team still, I think, needing, that star potential to round out this receiving core and needing that, solidified, clear-cut number one Canadian receiver that you could start out there, like a team like Winnipeg has with Nick Dembski. I think they really do need that guy still, and I think a guy that can give them an all-around skill set from a Canadian perspective at wide receiver is really needed still on this roster. And so I think that is a big need for them going into this draft. In terms of other needs, I think depth on the offensive line is always nice to have. So those are some spots I could see Ottawa going on draft day. Now, finally, with the most obvious team of all in terms of primary needs going into this CFL draft, and that is the BC Lions at offensive line. And basically, anything you need, interior, offensive tackle, it doesn't matter for this team. They just need more quality prospects up front on the offensive line. This looks like by far the weakest Canadian group on the offensive line, and as I mentioned in the video the other week, it's really important to have those quality Canadian offensive linemen contributing to your team. It's almost impossible to win in the CFL if you don't have that. So I think they need to, with that third overall pick, try to get the best offensive line prospect in this draft, or if you don't find there's somebody worthy of taking with that third overall pick, because it's not a great offensive line draft, or it's not seen to be a great offensive line draft, trade back a little bit and get multiple offensive linemen. You have to make sure that this is a better, offensive line up front for Nathan Rourke going into 2022. But I think that is the most obvious one of any team on this list, and it's really a desperate need for BC going into 2022. And with that said, those are, in my opinion, the biggest needs for every CFL team going into the 2022 CFL draft. Be sure to let me know in the comments section if you disagree with any of my selections. That is going to be the end of today's video, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the show, the best way to do it is by hitting the like button and subscribing to Huskies Huddle for more CFL content just like this. I greatly appreciate it, everybody. And with that said, hope you guys have a great day. Peace.